Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joel Burney, and on behalf of the co-sponsoring organisations, it is my honour to be your host for today's Melbourne book launch of Lone Voice, The Wars of Isi Leibler, written by Professor Suzanne Rutland. On behalf of the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, the Jewish Community Council of Victoria, Mizrahi, and the Zionist Federation of Australia, we thank you for joining us online today. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome the many members of the Liebler family, both near and far, who have been able to join us. Today you will of course hear from the author of this wonderful book, but you will also hear tributes and stories from some of Izzy's closest friends and family. Co-CEO of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Alex Ryvchin, will launch the book as well as introduce Professor Rutland. We are also joined by National Chairman of ECAJ and Izzy's brother, Mark Liebler, who will provide the concluding remarks. So, over the next 60 minutes, sit back and enjoy the Melbourne book launch of Lone Voice, The Wars of Isi Leibler. To kick things off today, here is a message from esteemed leader of the Australian Jewish community and close friend of Izzy, Sam Lipski.
Just 6 months ago, early in December, I spoke to Isi Leibler in Jerusalem, and he told me the story of the book. More precisely, he told me the story of the title of the book, of which he was very, very proud. He loved the idea of being lone voice, and that the subtitle of the book was The Wars of Isi Leibler. So I said, Izzy, that's a bit much and a bit strong, isn't it? After all, you know the great Jewish tradition that leadership, according to our sages and to our rabbis, differs between the tradition of Moshe, of Moses, and the tradition of Aaron. And Aaron was, as we know, Ohev Shalom, Odef Shalom. He loved peace and pursuer of peace. And here you are, trying to be a Jewish leader and talking about the wars of Isi Leibler. And Izzy laughed and he said, I'm no Aaron, but very kind of you to suggest that I might be a Moshe. Lahavdil, he said, lahavdil. It wasn't the last conversation I had with Izzy, but it was a conversation that focused on the importance, not just of this book, but of communication, of why a great leader has to be able to communicate. And whatever else Izzy was, and he was a great leader, he could communicate. In fact, he loved communication, not just because he had thousands and thousands and thousands of books, many of which he'd actually read from cover to cover. But he knew all his books, and he knew why writing things down mattered, why communicating mattered. And so this book was very important to him because, not just because of the great story that Suzanne Rutland was able to tell, spending 20 years of her writing life as an academic and historian putting it together, but because it told a story that was a story of our time. It was a story of Jewish history. And I want to say just a few brief words about why history was so important to Izzy. Quite obviously, apart from communicating well and being able to tell his story, Izzy had other great qualities as a leader. I'll just focus on three of them, which emerge from Suzanne's very important book. The first was courage. And I don't just mean spiritual courage and the idea of being able to persist and be resilient. Physical courage. I sat with Izzy, with KGB officials in Moscow. Yes, we had perestroika and all that, but it was still a case, if you argued strongly with a KGB official, as Izzy was able to do, I tell you what, it wasn't one of those moments that you wanted to be weak. Izzy could speak truth to power, not just because sometimes, a writer can write a book about a leader in a free country, but because he could look a KGB official directly in the eye, tell him what he thought and why he had to let the Jews go. The second thing that Izzy understood was power. He'd been a student of political science and politics all his life, and he understood power, not just power in communities, but power among nations. And he knew what powerlessness meant. If you know about power, You know that the Jewish people's history as a powerless nation until Israel came is not a history of a nation that can make its own way in the world. And Izzy understood that, and he knew why Israel was so central. And this leads me to the point about history. Izzy lived in the momentous period of Jewish history, not just in our time, but arguably in the history of the Jewish people, certainly since the destruction of the Second Temple. And he understood the three great peaks of Jewish history. The highest peak, the Mount Everest for him, was Israel, not the Holocaust, but he understood what the Holocaust meant. And he knew how Israel stood between the Holocaust and the Jews of the Soviet Union. And he dreamed the dream that only the great leaders of Israel had understood, that one day those Jews would be free. And he devoted his life to that. I'm telling you all this as his friend. He was my mentor. As a collaborator with Izzy, we worked together. I worked for him and with him. And of course, I miss him enormously. But Suzanne has done us all a great honor and presented us with a great privilege, because as a historian, she has placed Izzy in the framework of his times. And I just want to conclude with one last anecdote about Izzy. A long time ago, 60 years ago, when Izzy was a very young man, and he was the Director of Public Relations at the Victorian Jewish Board of Deputies, he had one informal job. And that was to translate from the Yiddish of those speakers who refused to speak English at the Jewish Board of Deputies. Izzy was no great Yiddishist, but he knew enough to be able to reinterpret and explain what those Yiddish speakers were talking about. And there's a phrase in Yiddish when we remember someone who is no longer with us, and we say, Covid sein Andenk. We give honor to his memory. Suzanne has given honor to Isi Leibler's memory.
I first got to know Izzy Liebler in the late 1970s when I was treasurer in the Fraser government. But I really was impressed by him and impressed with his commitment to justice and freedom in the mid-1980s when he began his ultimately very successful campaign for that group of Soviet Jews, as they then were called, the refuseniks. Jews have been persecuted in Russia or the Soviet Union through the ages. Certainly they were under the Tsarist regime and they were under the Soviet communist regime. And so many of them wanted to leave the Soviet Union and go to Israel and find freedom and hope and a better future. And the Soviet government at the time was reluctant to let that happen. And Izzy Leibler, as a leading figure in the Australian Jewish community, commenced a long and ultimately very effective campaign. He had a great influence on the then Australian Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, who was sympathetic to what Izzy was trying to achieve. I was then the leader of the opposition, and I was also sympathetic. And it struck me at the time how meticulous Izzy was in making sure that it was a bipartisan effort. He was dealing with the Labor government of the day, and he obviously wanted their sympathy, but he didn't ignore the then opposition. And that was a hallmark of Izzy, who became not only an extremely successful businessman in the travel and related industries in Australia and around the world, but a hugely significant leader of the Australian Jewish community. He exemplified what that community has always represented to me and to so many Australians. Dedicated and fiercely loyal Australians, obviously committed to the cause of Israel's independence and right to exist free from molestation and constant attack from its neighbours, and also a community itself that's made a remarkable contribution to the development and the success of Australia over the years. Izzy was very proud of his leadership of the Jewish community. He fought many battles against discrimination. He was successful in business. He's now spent years in Israel and whenever I visit that country, which I like to do as often as possible, though pretty hard at the moment for obvious reasons, I always like to look him up. And the last time I was there, I had a remarkably pleasant dinner with him and his wife. So this is a wonderful book. It has taken probably 15 to 20 years of research on and off to compile, and it's a very special tribute to a man who's always been a fine Australian, a dedicated and faithful Jew, and someone who believes very strongly, as I do, in the future durability, strength and rightful place in the world of the State of Israel.
Good afternoon. One of the great pleasures that I've found in working for the Executive Council of Australian Jewry for some 8 years now has been the short stroll from my office to our printer room. Somehow I found that on each such journey of merely 3 or 4 metres, I would be waylaid, thrown off my course as if by a tempest, and drawn instead to the boxes of archives and ECAJ correspondence going back to the 1940s, tucked away on the other side of the office. And once there, I would discover Izzy's file notes, which meticulously documented such things as meetings with the Palestinian representative in Canberra, Ali Kazak, and Nabil Shah, the senior Palestinian negotiator and an ex-prime minister, during which Izzy told Kazak to pipe down after an emotional outburst by Kazak. Time would become inconsequential as I would sink deeper into the dust and splendour of Australian Jewish history. What was I meant to be doing? What had I printed and why? Who could say? Such matters became irrelevant as I would take my tuition from the contemporaneous observations and thoughts of a Titan. Aside from learning from how Izzy conducted himself in difficult meetings, how he advocated, how he pressed and charmed, I would return to my office with an acute awareness of how the issues Izzy faced are more or less identical to those confronting the Australian Jewish community today. A day after I read the file note of Izzy's meetings with the Palestinian representatives, the same Ali Kazak published an obscene piece on the ABC website in which he repeated precisely the same charges he levelled in the meeting with Izzy: genocide, ethnic cleansing and the rest. The more I was therefore able to understand this history, read about our failings and triumphs, the better equipped I would be to face the challenges of the present day. Dr. Suzanne Rutland had already left her own mark on our community well before completing this monumental biography of Izzy. Suzanne's writing on the early history of the Australian Jewish community, the great battle to liberate Soviet families like mine, and the trends and flashpoints in Australian anti-Semitism from the Fanny Redding case to the firebombing of synagogues during the First Gulf War, has not only provided invaluable resources to which I and many others frequently turn, she has enlightened our community and our society through her rigour and scholarship. But Suzanne's latest production, the fruit of 20 years of labour, nearly a life sentence of archival exploration, deep thinking and skillful writing, is her greatest contribution yet. This book isn't merely a biography. It is a hugely ambitious work that tells the story of the post-war Australian Jewish community, indeed world Jewry, its defining battles, its friends and heroes, its egos and villains. Reading this book, it is difficult not to feel both overwhelmed and inspired by the breadth of the issues that converge on our community and our ability to overcome them one by one. Suzanne tells this story with the skill and depth of a historian of the highest order and a fine writer who lets the hundreds of wonderful anecdotes and episodes unfold. Her writing is understated, unintrusive, and clear. Reading this book, I was left with a complete understanding of the qualities that defined Isi Leibler, indeed the qualities that are common to all great Jewish leaders. Izzy was fearless, tireless, and brilliant. When a group of thugs rounded up the Jewish students at Caulfield Central School, forcing them into a woodshed and taunting them, an incident that may have triggered a sense in Izzy of the manner in which thousands of Jews met their end in places like Zhedbavny and Bogdanovka at the hands of their neighbours during the Holocaust, Izzy's response was to build an anti-bully alliance, which then, as Suzanne puts it, bashed them up one by one. In the years that followed, Izzy would take on anti-Zionists in his own community, neo-Nazis and war criminals, authors who mendaciously justified the massacre of Jews by the Ukrainians, the might of the Soviet Union, and the corruption and vanity that threatened to paralyze the Jewish communal world and destroy its ability to fight for the Jewish people. Izzy teaches us not only who to fight, being anyone who stands in the way of the rights and freedoms of the Jewish people, but how to fight. Suzanne shows us how Izzy formed alliances with communists to increase pressure on the Soviet Union, strengthening his hand and fighting on fewer fronts. How he resented Nahum Goldman's private diplomacy, a throwback to Jewish intercession in medieval times, which often led to doom. Izzy favoured a militant campaign to mobilise public opinion. He had no fear of standing up to revered figures when he felt they were wrong and something of significance was at stake. And he shows us the primacy of hard work, demonstrating his prodigious, ceaseless capacity to write, meet, contemplate, travel, and organise in order to achieve his aims. In this regard, Izzy was the successor of leaders like Herzl and Weizmann and the inspiration to the current generation of Jewish leaders who never say they're too busy and simply outwork their opponents. Suzanne asked me to say something about my relationship with Izzy. I only wish that relationship were greater. But over my years at the ECAJ, I had many communications with Izzy. It began after I read Suzanne and Sam's Let My People Go, and I wrote to Izzy to convey my deepest and most personal appreciation for what he did for me and for my family. I sent him the covers of the Australian Jewish Times and the Sydney Morning Herald, which featured photos of my family depicting the wave of refuseniks hitting our shores. I told Izzy I was fascinated by his friendship with Emanuel Litvinov, that great chronicler of Jewish life in London's East End. Izzy wrote to me after the publication of my first book to tell me I had a great talent for writing. I do hope that your current role does not restrict you from continuing to write, he told me. You are extremely gifted and articulate and passionate about Israel. You are thus in a key position to impact on the vast majority of uninformed Jews, especially on young people. Izzy's advice and praise meant a great deal to me, and it still does. In writing this book, Suzanne has immortalized a truly great man, whose teachings can now guide Jewish leaders for years to come. By providing me with this comprehensive volume, Suzanne will also keep me set on my tasks and prevent me from getting lost on my way to the printer. Suzanne has done an immense service to the Australian Jewish community in its leadership, present and future, and for that, she has our deepest gratitude. It now gives me great pleasure to declare this wonderful book officially launched in Melbourne, and to close by thanking my fellow speakers Mark Liebler and Sam Lipski, to express my condolences to Mark and the entire Liebler family, and to commend the great mensch Sam Saltzman for his dedication and agility in putting this event together despite some challenges, and to now introduce the author, a treasure and a dear friend, Dr. Suzanne Rutland.
Wow. I would like to thank both Sam and Alex for their moving words. Indeed, giving this talk is very emotional for me. When I was in Israel, we had a virtual launch of the book, which featured the video from John Howard, which we just saw, and later the video with Izzy himself being interviewed by the well-known veteran Israeli journalist Ehud Yaari, which we will show shortly. As you will see, Izzy is in fine form, and after each segment of the launch, the camera zoomed in on Izzy and Naomi, sitting in Izzy's study. Izzy was beaming and on top of the world. It is hard to imagine that Izzy is no longer with us. His son Jonathan told me that after the Bar Ilan launch, he went downhill, and in less than a month, he had passed away. He died the day before I flew back to Sydney, and I was able to attend his funeral and the first minyan to share my condolences with the family. Just to give you an idea of Izzy's status, Sarah and Bibi Netanyahu attended one of his first minyanim. Sam spoke about the title Lone Voice, The Wars of Isi Leibler, really the suggestion of my editor, Elliot Yeager. However, I knew that the title had to have the concept of Izzy, the fighter, in it, because Izzy was a fighter all his life, as we have heard from Alex, from his responding to anti-Semitism in his government high school to his 30 years of struggle with Soviet Jewry, including his chutzpah of standing up to Dr. Nachum Goldman, through to his battles with Qantas, to one of the greatest battles of his life with the World Jewish Congress. Izzy was never afraid to stand up for what he believed in. Indeed, as we have heard, his courage and fearlessness were one of his key characteristics. And he understood the issues of both Jewish power and Jewish powerlessness, both of which we have seen over the last 2 weeks in terms of Izzy's battle in Gaza and at the same time the ongoing vilification of Jews and Israel. Over the last 20 years, I had the privilege of researching in Izzy's unique archive and extensive library, what I call a treasure trove for an historian. You might ask how I got the key to this treasure trove. At the end of last century, I was approached to write a history of Jewish communal leadership in Australia. I became engrossed in the struggle for Soviet Jewry. I was aware of Izzy's landmark 1965 publication on Soviet Jewry and human rights, and that Rex Mortimer had written a letter that we can see here at the beginning of the publication, acknowledging the anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, clearly illustrated here. I managed to get access to Mortimer's secret security file from the National Archives of Australia and found that each time Izzy's name was mentioned, there was a number indicating that he also had a security file. However, when I applied for access to the file, I was told they could not locate it. After 9 months back and forth with their saying they could not find it, and my insisting it must be there, they finally located it. It was unbelievable. As part of his efforts, Izzy was constantly chasing Australian communist leaders because he had been urged by the legendary Shaul Avigor, who had recruited him, to see if he could get a communist leader to admit to Soviet anti-Semitism. Avigor stressed that there was no point for others to make that claim because the Soviet response would just be that they were anti-communist. A communist leader who had spent time in Moscow and was deeply embedded in the party, such as Rex Mortimer, was another story. During a visit to Jerusalem at the end of 1999, I came armed with some of these telephone conversations between Izzy and about Izzy, with conversations they had behind his back. While ASIO was not tapping Izzy's phone, they were tapping the phones of the various communist leaders. Some of these copies included conversations between two Melbourne Jewish communists, Bernie Taft, a party hack, and Judah Watton, an Australian writer and novelist who Izzy hated with a passion, and Izzy reciprocated, Walton reciprocated Izzy's feelings. These conversations were often very derogatory, as we can see here with Watton. There was nothing there. They have to go to all these places. But with Liebler, it was just a waste of time. Liebler had his views, and everything else was just maneuvers. Izzy had always suspected he had a surety file, but now he knew his suspicions were correct. I had found the key to the treasure trove, and here we are today, celebrating the publication of his biography. In a letter to Izzy upon reading the book, Rabbi Hirsch, Honorary Life President of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, wrote that one thing that made Izzy unique among lay leaders was that, and I quote, generally, most lay leadership was a consequence of their philanthropic contributions. Your leadership, Izzy, is also philanthropic, but primarily intellectual. More than anyone else in your generation, you have used your pen and your voice to advocate for institutional integrity. I believe that this really sums up Izzy's manifold contributions, which were not only based on his political activism, but also the way he was able to put pen to paper. As was seen, whether it was with his book on Soviet Jewry and human rights in the 1960s, the case for Israel in the 1970s, his concern about Jewish religious extremism in the 1980s, his many columns in the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom, or his fight against corruption in the World Jewish Congress. And his intellectual strength came from firm foundations, as we have heard from Sam, his love of books. From 1957, before his father died, when he wrote to his parents that he would begin salivating every time he passed a Jerusalem bookshop, but then he had to check with his parents how much he could spend, to when he could buy whatever he wanted, and it went to the last months of his life. He was a true Renaissance man with a love of art, music, books, and all fine things. And he was an absolute perfectionist. At the same time, he was a family man, and his family meant everything to him, as we see at the end of the book, with this image of his 4 children, his 17 grandchildren, and his expanding family of great grandchildren. In his last years in his beloved Eretz Israel, he could feel a deep sense of achievement. As an historian of our community, I am grateful to Izzy for giving me this opportunity to take this journey into his amazing life, to Naomi for being such a supportive life partner, to his son Jonathan for his assistance and enthusiasm, to my editor Elliot Yeager, who contributed so much, to Judith Landau, Izzy's PA, for all her willing help and patience, and to my children's support. This evening, I would also like to particularly thank Sam Saltzman for all his amazing efforts to ensure that this launch happened, and to the sponsoring organizations, particularly to Joel Burney of ECAJ for all his help. May we all be inspired by Izzy's battle to keep fighting for human rights and the well-being of Eretz Israel and Yisrael, a battle which we shall now hear him speak about with this interview with Ehud Ya'ari, recorded especially for the Bar Ilan launch. Zichrano Levracha. May his memory be for a blessing.
Hi, Izzy.
Hi, Ehud.
You're a warrior without a gun, and you have waged many battles in your life. From Qantas to the claims conference. What's your motto?
I am, by nature, a stubborn person, but I've always felt that when something is worth pursuing, you pursue it. And in my leadership roles, the one thing I never did, which many of my contemporaries did, was to look and see what the popular vote was. I always felt if something was right, you lead, you get people to follow you, you don't follow what is the popular thing. And in many times, I found myself in a situation where I had the majority against me, but was subsequently vindicated because justice, the thing I was fighting for, in most cases, I believe, and I think history proves, were justified.
You were never reluctant to take on strong opponents.
I experienced anti-Semitism when I was a little boy in school. I was a refugee from Belgium, just on the edge, just in the beginning of the Shoah, and I remember the Jewish boys in my class being taken into a shed in the lunchtime and being abused. And I got them outside afterwards and I said, we have to fight back. All of them said, let it go. I got to get a number of my non-Jewish friends and we beat up every one of those guys. And I said to myself, you have to fight. You don't just take what's given to you. And nothing is impossible if it's right. And I think that started me on a path where I just simply was not prepared to compromise what I thought was right.
How difficult was the switch from diamonds to the travel industry?
The travel grew into something huge, again, because I got into confrontations. They thought they were putting me away, straight away. And every one of my friends told me, you are up against a giant, you're also up against the greatest cartel in the world, IATA, which has to back the national carrier, give it up. And we went through the courts, and I must tell you, I was not sleeping nights thinking of the tactics and determining not to give up. And we finally won, but it was a hell of a battle.
You were drawn to public life early on, in Australia and then here in Israel. What drove you?
I had a family, a father who became the president of the local Jewish community and was in a sense a representative of all the East European Jews who came and upturned the Anglo-Jewish establishment and took over. And my mother, who was very much involved in religious Zionism, she was one of the creators of Emunah, as it was then called, Ladies Mizrahi, and they showed me a feeling, there was always discussion in the house about problems facing the community. And I automatically fell into B'nai Akiva, of which I was one of the founders, and from that point on, I then became a head of the students' organization, which widened my horizons and enabled me to see the world in its widest gap from a religious Zionist viewpoint.
You have reached the leadership position in the Australian Jewish community, which I think is one of the best examples of successful advocacy for Israel and Jewish causes. Why?
I was a passionate Zionist. I was brought up in a passionate Zionist environment. And I felt that Jewish communities had so much after the Shoah, what was left of them, It was so important for us to retain the state that it was part and parcel of me. Every day I thought of the state of Israel and how important it was for me as a Jew. And I think that that was what impelled me the most. Israel was a centrality of my life. And I had always had ambitions to come and live here, but I became, because of circumstances, a Zionist who was encouraging others to go. And I'm very glad I was able to break that and come myself with my wife.
You have enlisted the support of Australian communists in the battle you were involved in for the rescue of Soviet Jewry.
I was the most hated person by the Communist Party. Their newspaper would carry articles describing me in the most despicable terms. Their chief agent, a man called Judah Watton, a true Jewish renegade, called me every name under the sun. And somehow or other, I felt that when problems were beginning with the Togliatti party, with the Italians, now was the time to try the soft spot. And I found two people, one a Jew and one a non-Jew, the non-Jew being the most responsible. And I managed to convince them that there was a problem. And I wrote an article, they agreed to accept an article for me in their journal. That article became so big that it became a booklet called Soviet Jewry and Human Rights. Now, what was my muzzle was, instead of ignoring it, it turned the communist world upside down. The Soviet embassy went berserk. The chief rabbi of Moscow abused me. All the leaders in Russia, Cold Warrior and all the rest of it, they made it into a personality.
How would you sum up your contribution to the campaign to get the doors open for Soviet Jews?
I would say
30 years of...
I would say the first was getting the first country in the world to raise this at the United Nations. That was critically important, and I'm told by people from within Israel that this had an impact on the government, which was then divided between Golda Meir and another group which said we should stand up and fight the Soviets, and the others that said it's useless. We should just try to coexist. When a country like Australia got up at the United Nations, apparently that tipped them over. And that's when they went into high gear. I was recruited by leading Israelis.
Shaul Avigur, the great.
Yes, he recruited me. When I first saw him, I was introduced to him by the ambassador, said someone to come and see me. He was most unimpressive. When I learned who he was, I was in a state of shock. And he said, you are going to represent us in the South Pacific region, Moshe Dekta in the United States, and Emmanuel Litvinov in London. The three of you are going to coordinate activities on Soviet Jewry. And we did. And the biggest enemy we had in our fight was none other than Nachum Goldman. Nachum Goldman was the king of the Jews. He'd been successful with reparations. He had a tongue of gold. Whatever he said went.
You had a big fight with him.
I was invited to go to a World Jewish Congress assembly meeting in Strasbourg. I was only 30 years old, and I got up and I made a 15-minute speech where I accused him of Stadlanut, explained what it was, and said that this is what has cursed us, and etc., etc. And I thought I'd be booed. To my amazement, when I sat down, I had a standing ovation. People were cheering. And to make matters better, Nachum Goldman was so outraged that he spent at least 1 hour attacking me, which made me, again, a world personality.
In the book you speak about a good old friend of mine, Reuven Merchav,
Yes.
and how you help him and others open up China, open up India, which was very hostile, hard to believe today. Can you briefly sum up your contribution there?
I had a connection through business with a top man, one of the top people, advisors to the foreign minister, the head of the American Institute. And this man gave me an interview, allowed things. I invited him to come to Australia and address a university, which was a nice way for a Chinese person to have a holiday. And he grabbed at it. I said, there's one condition. That one condition is you come for my dinner at my place and you meet an Israeli who I'm not going to tell you now who he is. That's where I got him and Reuven Merchav together. And from that point on, we kept moving. And I will never forget 2 weeks beforehand when the Chinese foreign minister met me and said, tell your people in 2 weeks we're going to have foreign relations with Israel. Now, I'm not saying I did that. I'm saying that this is part of a parcel of events which were moving in that direction.
India was more difficult.
India was much more difficult. India, I met Indira Gandhi. She was a role model of the third world greats. And I spoke to her and she said to me, I'll never forget, it's your people who are turning the Americans against me. It's you Jews who are making life difficult for me. And I remember saying to her, I thought it was my people who were always, when you were in London in exile, fighting for Indian independence. And she left me very, very bitter taste in my mouth that this woman was no friend of Jews. In fact, she detested Jews. I then, through the good offices of my foreign minister, managed to get an interview with another Indian Prime Minister, Rao. And this Indian Prime Minister, again, was a tough character. And I'll never forget one thing. The Australian ambassador had never met him and begged me to include him in the delegation. I said to him, look, my friend, you don't want to come to this. It's not going to be pleasant for you. No, I want to see him. And he sat there and trembled because I told this fellow, I thought I'd lost it, by the way. I told this fellow, you're going to New York in 2 weeks. They will treat you worse than Saddam Hussein if you don't recognize Israel. And he screamed at me, and the meeting was over, and I went with my head, pretty down. I thought, I've done it this time. I was no diplomat. 2 weeks later, diplomatic relations were announced.
So how come you decide to take this big company that you have built, Jet Set, and pack up and come to Israel in 1999?
Look, I wanted to come to Israel when I graduated. My father died, I came to Israel, I had to go back and look after a family business. And when the opportunity came and I'd made money and I was established, I felt now's the time, because my children, who I was turning into Zionists and they were making Aliyah, I was certainly not going to stay behind in Australia and have the rest of my family living here in Israel. And I've been going backwards and forwards, but I found one thing. Australia is so far away that you can't live in two places at once. You have to choose. And the choice was a very simple choice. And it's the best choice we made over 20 and 21 years ago. My wife and I have never, ever looked back. And we say we were privileged at that late stage in our lives, already 60s, to make it here and to still live and participate in the life of Israel.
One of the battles that you were waging, and I remember that because you were talking to me about that at the time, was with the World Jewish Congress.
Look, I saw the World Jewish Congress.
That was quite probably one of the toughest
Was
duels in the world of Jewish politics.
Ehud, you have to understand that I took on not only the giants of the World Jewish Congress, but I took on the American establishment in a sense. But when I came to Israel and I became more involved in the World Jewish Congress, I asked questions about the financing. And I got such a torrent of abuse that I smelt something was wrong. And this went on and it exploded. And I discovered that millions of dollars was being diverted, let's put it in a nice way. And then 3 months later, they threw me out because they saw I was going to be a thorn in their side. And I will never forget.
Enfant terrible.
Yeah, I will never forget. They called the World Jewish Congress meeting, governing board meeting, not a governing board meeting, a general assembly to have elections, which was not the due time, only to get rid of me, because I was a senior vice president. And I must say, never in my life have I faced such a hostile crowd.
Yeah.
500 people were there, and I spoke by myself, being booed, not allowed to stand on the platform, being booed by 500 people, and people said he's finished. And at the end, it was unearthed, and Bronfman himself, before he died, Edgar Bronfman, before he died, said to me, I made a mistake, Singer was stealing from me. And he wasn't stealing from him, he was stealing from people that gave public monies.
You have taken very clear-cut stand. In your articles in Israel Hayom, Jerusalem Post, on issues of the state and religion, critical of the Haredi politicians. Can you give me, please, the gist of your position on that?
I'm a religious Zionist, and I believe in moderation. And people like the late Yosef Burg were friends of mine, although he was much older, but that was the kind of approach that I liked. What was happening with religious Zionism was it was going in two extreme paths. One path was they were going Haredi, in other words, extreme, extreme, extreme. Each one was trying to outdo one another in the severity of interpretation of halakha, and that applied to things like conversions and wedding.
Would there be a Hebrew translation of your biography?
It is currently being translated, and I hope it will be out within a year and a half or so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ehud.
Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet this afternoon, and by paying my deep respect to their history, their culture, and their unique ongoing contribution to this vital city. You know, I can't help but reflect on what my brother would make of the escalated conflict between Israel and Hamas these last weeks. The analysis he would offer in his Candidly Speaking from Jerusalem column, and the even more frank analysis he would share on our regular telephone discussions. Now, while I have a pretty good idea what he would say, the fact that the column is no more because Izzy is no longer with us leaves a terrible vacuum, both personally and indeed for the entire Jewish world. Because sadly, the reality is that there are very few Jewish leaders today who are gifted with both Izzy's passion and his talent. When I sat down to think about what to say today, it struck me that today is our father's Yahrzeit, and it seems to me to be a very fitting coincidence. Because losing our father at such an early age, he was only 47 years old, Izzy was 23, and I was 14, had such a huge impact on us and our younger brother, Alan. It was a major influence on the future trajectory of our lives. When our father passed away, Izzy didn't think twice about abandoning his lifelong dream of living in Israel. Instead, returning to Melbourne to be with our mother, Alan and me, and to run the family business. I have described Izzy as the gold standard of global Jewish leadership. But it should be understood that Izzy's top priority was always family and family values. And in this realm also, he was the gold standard, right from the outset and right until the very end of his life. So it's hardly surprising that his biography conjures up memories and emotions that go far deeper than if I were reading the story of a person whose life coincided with my own only superficially, or indeed not at all. I was especially moved by the early chapters that relate to our childhood, not so much by the memories, but the revelations, aspects of our family history that I'd never discussed with our parents or with Izzy, but discovered on the pages of Lone Voice. I was also deeply affected by stories of Izzy's courage and moral compass recounted in the book, which I experienced alongside him. The first was the battle he waged on behalf of his travel business, Jet Set, against an almighty campaign from Australia's #1 airline, Qantas, to put him out of business, completely out of business. Taking place through the year immediately before I became a partner alongside Arnold Bloch in 1969, and the year after, I worked with Izzy to defend Jet Set against accusations of violating industry regulations. The long, gruelling case drew in a lineup of lawyers who would go on to make their mark on the Australian justice system and beyond. As a young lawyer, just returned from a year of study at Yale, it was a formative experience, and I can admit, half a century later, there were times I felt the odds were completely stacked against us. But Izzy remained utterly focused, utterly steadfast. He would not countenance being bullied, and ultimately he and Jet Set prevailed. The second example of Izzy's resolve that resonates with me to this day is his decision to place in jeopardy what had been a very close relationship with Bob Hawke, referred to in one of the reviews as a bromance. Many of you will know the story, but for those who don't, the close relationship imploded in 1988 after the then Prime Minister told a very large Jewish audience in Melbourne, including 15 newly released refuseniks, that the sorry plight of Russian Jews equated with that of Palestinians in Israel. It took a different kind of courage than what I had observed through the Jet Set case, but courage nonetheless to fracture a friendship with such a powerful, charismatic figure. To place values and integrity above all else. In his determination to shine a light on the corruption he suspected in the upper echelons of the World Jewish Congress, my brother was similarly impervious to the kind of intimidation that can be brought to bear when great wealth, power and status are challenged. Day after day, Izzy and I would speak over the phone, strategising on how to respond to the barrage of intimidation and abuse wrought by the organisation's president, Edgar Bronfman, and its most senior professional, Israel Singer, including a multi-million-dollar libel action. Once again, with history having fallen squarely in Izzy's court, I can admit to having worried at the time whether this was a battle worth pursuing for my brother. So these are just 3 stories I can relate to you because I was there. I was on the spot. But I'm profoundly mindful that words really can't do justice to the qualities that made Izzy the giant that he was. His toughness and intellect, of course, but equally powerful was the warmth and charm of the man. Izzy's biography is called Lone Voice, which is apt, as Izzy was indeed a warrior for the Jewish people. But unlike many Jewish leaders today, Izzy knew when it was time for war and time for diplomacy. And readers of the book will learn that many of his greatest achievements were achieved through meaningful relationships he developed even with people with whom he disagreed. It's no secret that our relationship went through a difficult period, something that, with the benefit of hindsight and maturity, we both regretted. The period of friction between us as individuals never affected the close ties between our families, though, and ultimately brought Izzy and me closer than might otherwise have been the case. And for the past 2 decades, we and our respective children became even closer. These last few weeks, I find myself surrounded by the places where Izzy and I spent our childhoods and much of our adult lives together. I sit in my seat in shul next to Izzy's old seat and can almost relive our hushed conversations under the rabbi's stern gaze. I look out of my kitchen window at what used to be Izzy and Naomi's house, right next door, and remember the free flow of children back and forth, Izzy sneaking over to have an occasional cigarette, Sunday barbecues by the pool, surrounded by family. I drive past Izzy's old office on my way to work every day and recall our l'chaims in the late afternoons. And perhaps most poignantly, I pass by our mother's old house every day. The house where we grew up, shared in each other's triumphs, where we spent almost every Shabbat and Yom Tov together. And whilst I miss my brother deeply, I draw comfort and inspiration from all of the memories I've shared this afternoon. So I commend Izzy's biography, Lone Voice, to you. To Suzanne Rutland I say, you've created a fascinating, enlightening, and inspiring read. Thank you for doing justice to my brother's life and achievements.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for this afternoon. On behalf of all of the co-sponsoring organisations, thank you so much for your participation. To our speakers, to Sam, to Alex, to Suzanne and Mark, thank you also. And to all of our Victorian and Melbourne guests, please stay safe during the lockdown. And to our international guests, thank you so much for your participation. And that's bye for now.